Welcome to lesson 4. We're going to take a look at the health hype behind intermittent fasting and compare it to the research evidence. Let's begin with a recent systematic review. This one is by Wei and colleagues. And they took a look at cardiometabolic, inflammatory, and appetite outcomes associated with intermittent energy restriction for weight loss. So this paper is significant because it's one of, if not the largest systematic review examining intermittent energy restriction versus continuous energy restriction to date. And this paper involved 27 randomized controlled trials on humans. And they found that direct comparisons of intermittent energy restriction and continuous energy restriction showed no significant differences in long-term weight loss or fat loss. So one thing you'll find about a lot of the intermittent fasting research is a lot of the most interesting and, in quotes, newsworthy findings are short term. But when you look at studies examining periods like 6 months or more, then the significant differences between the intermittent fasting conditions versus the daily caloric restriction conditions just disappear. Okay, so these authors found no significant long-term differences between intermittent energy restriction and continuous energy restriction for cardiometabolic, body compositional, inflammatory, appetite, and energy intake outcomes. And the conclusion was that overall, this systematic review shows no long-term clinical or body compositional advantages of intermittent energy restriction versus continuous energy restriction. And this result is anticlimactic, and a lot of times, of course, it's going to be disappointing for people who are very invested in intermittent fasting, either from an ideological or commercial standpoint. And when people find what works for them, there's this human nature tendency to feel, well, number one, thrilled because you kind of found the magic bullet, or at least you think you did. And number two, gosh, since this method clicked with me and it worked for me, I got to spread the gospel because it has to work for everybody else, right? Well, not necessarily. So the take home point is eloquently put by Professor Corey Reinders, in a narrative review that was done in 2019 on this topic. And it's one of the best papers on the topic that I've personally read. And I've read a lot of papers on intermittent fasting. And so just to quote the salient excerpt here, in general, the available evidence suggests that intermittent fasting offers little to no advantage over continuous energy restriction for improvements in risk factors for cardiometabolic disease. Small reductions in total cholesterol, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, triglycerides, and fasting glucose and insulin with intermittent fasting have been reported in several studies, but these changes are generally similar in magnitude to those observed with continuous energy restriction. And then the clincher. Because weight loss was similar in most studies, it appears that the magnitude of weight loss, rather than the dietary treatment, is the most important factor driving these changes. This is an important study to discuss as well. This one by Templeton and colleagues in 2021, because they looked at the effects of intermittent fasting on lean subjects. And just to take a couple steps back, there's a lot of research on intermittent fasting on overweight and obese subjects, naturally, to alleviate the chronic disease and comorbidities associated with states of obesity and overweight. So it is quite rare that intermittent fasting models in the research are tested on lean subjects, but this particular study is one of the few that's broken that ground. So it was a 3-week trial testing both maintenance or eucaloric, the jargon, eucaloric and hypocaloric conditions. So maintenance conditions as well as caloric deficit conditions. Both of those conditions were tested in this study. Markers of cardiometabolic health, hormone levels, and expression of key genes were not different between groups. Alternate day fasting was less effective at reducing body fat mass, but it reduced more lean mass compared to daily energy restriction that was matched for the caloric deficit by the end of the week. So that's pretty interesting. Same deficit by the end of the week, but greater lean mass losses in the alternate day fasting model compared to the daily caloric restriction model in these lean subjects. So, after isolating the variable of fasting in lean subjects, no evidence of fasting specific effects on metabolic regulation or cardiovascular health were seen. So, in other words, there were no special effects seen by intermittent energy restriction compared to daily caloric restriction. And in fact, in this study, because they were using lean subjects, they actually saw a detriment on lean body mass loss in the alternate day fasting group. Now, granted, there are different variants of intermittent fasting, and alternate day fasting is just one of the variants, and it's probably the most aggressive variant in terms of its potential to threaten lean body mass preservation. But the fact of the matter is, the hype around fasting centers around the fasting phase, the fasting cycles per se. So the fasting aspect of these fasting and feeding cycles. So the purported magic is in the prolonged nature of the fasting. And so you would think that in order to reap the maximum benefits from intermittent fasting, then, well, the variants of intermittent fasting that have the longest fasting periods are probably better for the supposed magic to health and longevity. But unfortunately, that comes with the potential risk of losing lean body mass. And this risk increases as you engage in a variant such as alternate day fasting as you get leaner. So it can be looked at from the perspective of it working and offering benefit until it eventually doesn't. So when somebody's starting off in a state of obesity, then threats to lean mass as a result of a caloric deficit and even an aggressive caloric deficit, they start off very low. Those risks for losing undue amounts of lean mass start off very low. And so as you get leaner, the inherent threat to lean mass preservation increases as you maintain and try to impose a caloric deficit. And so with intermittent fasting variants, they get less effective at causing beneficial health effects as you get leaner. So if you use intermittent fasting as a means to go from a state of overweight or obesity to a lean or slash healthy body composition, then that can be justified. However, the claim that there is some inherent cardiometabolic benefit to intermittent fasting, that doesn't look to be true as far as the weight of the evidence looks currently. And in other words, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle the benefit of weight loss and fat loss per se from the actual method that you do it. So those benefits, weight loss, fat loss, there are many roads to Rome. And the fact that intermittent fasting doesn't have necessarily special effects compared to daily caloric restriction, it shouldn't be a disappointment. Of course, it's always going to be a disappointment to people who are just sort of religiously fanatical about it. But to us practitioners, the fact that it works similarly and the fact that there are many methods to use is a good thing, because it's just another tool in the toolbox to use or to prescribe or recommend to people who have a preference for it. And there are different variants of intermittent fasting. There's alternate day fasting, which we just discussed. There's time restricted feeding. And then there's variants like the twice weekly feeding model or the 5-2 model. And of course, there are consecutive day fasting models as well. But yes, as far as the evidence stands today, no special effects to intermittent energy restriction compared to continuous energy restriction for improving cardiometabolic health outside of weight loss and fat loss per se. So it comes down to personal preference and what you can actually stick to in the long term. And with that, we conclude this lesson.